I wish so much that I were there this weekend with you in person, but the airlines would not permit it. So here I am sharing my presentation with you via Zoom. So at least we have the technology to do that. Before I begin, I want to thank our sponsors. This breakout session is sponsored by Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We are grateful for their generous support to help make this session possible. You can learn more about Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary by visiting their booth in the exhibit hall or online at sebts.edu. Now, I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer here because way back when I first scheduled this session and I was asked to present, I knew I wanted to do a session on my current book in progress that I'm working on. And so I had to submit a title and a topic way ahead of time. And I want to alert you that the topic has changed slightly because I want to do something more foundational than I expected. I think the session is called something like the impact of literature in spiritual formation. And what I'm actually going to talk about is the impact of the imagination in spiritual formation. So it's a little bit broader. I will touch on some literature. Anyone who knows me knows that I love to read literature, write about literature, talk about it, and I do that quite a bit. And what I'm doing in this session and actually in my book is talking more about how it is that literature has the effect that it does on us, including spiritual formation, by looking at the imagination. So sorry for the little bit of a bait and switch, but hopefully if you signed up for this topic, you'll be interested in this one as well, because it is very closely related, and I will talk about some literature. Many of us do associate imagination with children's playtime, creative problem solving, and hobbits. And for those of us who think of imagination in these ways, imagination might seem to be just something that's fun, optional, enjoyable, but indulgent. We also tend to think of imagination as some sort of an individual ability or gift. We might tell someone, use your imagination, or you might say about a friend, she's really imaginative. And we think that that's something that other people might have, and we don't, or we do and they don't, because we think about it as an individual kind of gift or ability. And it is that. But most of us aren't likely to think of imagination as something that is part of and arises from our communal experience and something that exerts tremendous influence on our social lives and our culture and even our religious beliefs and practices. But the power of imagination is large, pervasive, and overwhelming. Imagination entails much more than our individual fancies and visions and dreams, and its hold on us reaches far beyond the limits of our own individual minds. The imagination shapes us and shapes our world more than I would say any other human power or ability. Communities, societies, movements, and yes, even religions, including the evangelical Christian faith, are formed and fueled by the power of the imagination. And as I've already said, evangelicals are no exception. Now, this is not to suggest that the basis for our faith, the Holy Scriptures, God's Word, Christ incarnate, that it's not to suggest that those things are imaginary or that the creeds or the great cloud of witnesses are imaginary. By no means. They are real. But rather it is that the evangelical imagination, like the imagination at the heart of any culture, has been forming a kind of people, and those people have been helping to form the world for hundreds of years. But let me back up a little bit and just talk about what do I mean when I talk about the evangelical imagination, if I don't mean hobbits and Narnia, which it includes those, but it's much more than that. So first, I think we just need to consider what the imagination itself is. At its most literal level, the word imagination refers to the mind's process of making an image, the act of imaging. In this way, imagination is pretty simple. It's just also a very solitary individual behavior. I make an image in my mind. And yet there is so much that's not simple, that surrounds this image making activity. And it includes far more than just me alone making an image independently in my own mind. Because the images that we make are drawn from the objects we perceive. And what we perceive depends on what makes up our surroundings. It also depends on what we pay attention to. And what we pay attention to derives from a host of experiences, associations, emotions, thoughts, practices, and habits. Do you have the habit of looking up when you walk? Then you will notice things and people above and around you. Do you have the habit of staring at your phone as you go through your day, looking down? Okay, I admit I do that too much. Then you will notice far less of the physical things around you. Just as our dreams at night are filled with the things that fill our days, so our imagination is formed and filled by the things that we perceive. Reality as we understand it is what registers. And we all know some of us have to see, hear, or read something half a dozen times before it registers. I know that's true of me. This ability of the human mind to imagine, to make images, also reflects the marvelous fact that we are made in the image of God. We are the product of his holy imagination in a very literal as well as a metaphorical way. The ability to imagine, which seems unique to human beings, is actually a reminder of the one whose image we are made in. We who are made in God's image from his imagination reflect our Creator's image through our own acts of imagination. Imagination engages our whole humanity, physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. This truth is the starting point of any right understanding of the imagination, of its role, its power, and its significance. So imagination in some ways is very simple, and yet our ideas about the workings and wonders of the imagination have a long and complicated history. Like all of the marvels of human abilities, imagination has been idolized, and it's been debased, and it's been held in every valuation in between. At times, imagination has been understood, as I've already talked about, as sort of just physical, mechanistic, mental function, while at other times it has been treated as mystical or even magical and sometimes transgressive. And throughout the modern age, imagination has become increasingly understood as a phenomenon connected to perception. So imagination in the past was conceived as more objective, just simply recording in the mind an image. But now we understand the more subjective aspect, which is based on personal, sensory, emotional experience. So it moved from being understood in this mechanistic way to a more organic way, from intellectual to sensory. But the fact is that we actually can't separate out those things from one another, as people in the past tried to do. We are understanding more the interconnectedness between the intellect and the senses, between objective and subjective. In his book, Imagining the Kingdom, James K.A. Smith describes imagination as, quote, a kind of faculty by which we navigate and make sense of our world, but in ways and on a register that flies below the radar of conscious reflection, and specifically in ways that are fundamentally aesthetic in nature. So I want to unpack that a little bit. So what he's saying here is that imagination is a faculty. It's often underneath the surface of conscious reflection. I mean, we are conscious of many of the things that we imagine, but many of them we are not. And when he says it's fundamentally aesthetic in nature, what he's talking about is the basic etymology of the word aesthetic, which we think of as being related to beauty, which it is, but also to bodily sensory experience. And I'm going to actually stop here for a second and throw something in that occurs to me, that anyone who has any experience or knowledge of trauma knows that trauma is along with everything else that is a bodily response. It's aesthetic. I'm going to describe a little bit more of what Smith means, and then talk about that relationship to trauma a little bit more, because even if we aren't talking about a traumatic experience or haven't had that kind of trauma, understanding understanding trauma actually helps us, I think, to understand what I'm trying to say about how the imagination works. Because much of the action of our action, and this is actually Smith again, I'm quoting, it's kind of a long quote, so bear with me, it's helpful. Much of our action is not the fruit of conscious deliberation. Instead, much of what we do grows out of our passional orientation to the world, affected by all the ways we've been primed to receive the world. In short, our action emerges from how we imagine the world. And that shaping of our character is, to a great extent, the effect of stories that have captivated us, that have sunk into our bones, stories that picture what we think life is about, what constitutes the good life. We live into the stories we've absorbed. We become characters in the drama that has captivated us. Thus, much of our action is acting out a kind of script that has unconsciously captured our imaginations. Now, again, that was a long quote from Jamie Smith and Imagining the Kingdom, just unpacking that idea that there is sort of a part of imagination that is related to our bodily experience, and then the way that we imagine the world because of the stories that we tell ourselves about that. What I mentioned before about trauma, if you know anything about that, I think it immediately makes sense, because we know, especially if you've read that wonderful book, The Body Keeps the Score, that if we have experienced something that then becomes sort of a story that sinks into our bones, any kind of trigger that we encounter is going to cause our body to respond in the way that it's already imagined based on that previous experience. And imagination sort of always works that way. If we smell a scent that we remember from our mother in childhood, it brings back all kinds of associations with it, just because that's in our imagination. Or the same with food, or hearing a song from years ago. The way that things can instantly come back to us is because of how those sensory and imaginative experiences sink into our bones, as Smith has said. So in this way, Smith kind of sums it up. Perception is already an evaluation. Again, we perceive what we pay attention to. And what we pay attention to has everything to do with the stories that are already in our head. We act based on what we imagine about the objective external world, yet we also imagine based on what we perceive and receive from the world. Thus, and this is the writer Kieran Egan, who is writes in the field of education. He says the function of the imagination is such that it never merely copies the world or translates perceptions. It is a constantly active and creative faculty that shapes the world we perceive, and that uses our hopes, fears, and other emotions in that shaping. So now bear with me. I know this is very theoretical and philosophical, but I hope I'm laying a strong foundation for what I want to talk about in terms of literature and the evangelical imagination by the time we get to the end. This meaning-making function of the imagination connects directly to religion, because religion is the ultimate source and arbiter of meaning. So because imagination creates images out of our sense perceptions, it actually constitutes, Janine Langan and the Christian imagination says, our fundamental mode of insertion in the world. And therefore it has deep religious implications. Imagination makes sense out of our sensory perceptions, sort of directs us in the way we insert ourselves in the world, and that has implications for what we believe and how we act out those beliefs. So clearly, just to summarize this part of the session, imagination is not just simply making an image in the mind's eye. The images we make are drawn from what we attend to, and what we attend to are things that have already have meaning for us. And those things create more meaning for us as we pay attention to them. So the images we make arise from and make meaning in our lives. And it is impossible then to separate the role our religious belief has, first in directing our perceptions and what we pay attention to, and then in the meaning that we make from them. So both of these things, the role of our perceptions and our meaning making, have profound implications on for our theological understanding. So I've talked a little or a lot, depending on your perspective, about the imagination. And now I want to talk about the social imaginary. The imagination, I've said, is something that we do sort of independently as individuals, but we also enact it collectively. And the social imaginary is a way of talking about sort of our collective imagination. So, as I've already said, imagination is a reflection of God's image in all human beings. And that in itself is suggestive for how we treat the work of our own imaginations and the work of other people's imaginations. Our imaginations create dreams for the future, plans for our next vacation, conjectures about the meeting our boss asked us to have, and countless works of music, poetry, and art. Collectively, our works of imagination reflect and create entire cultures. Sculptures uphold standards of beauty. Love songs shape our views of love. Movies give us images of sexual encounters that establish norms and expectations, whether right or wrong. As Percy Bysshe Shelley famously wrote in 1821, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. In other words, what Shelley was saying is that creative works, and not just poetry, but novels, films, drama, photographs, advertisements, and even TikToks, form our imagination so powerfully that they carve their laws into our hearts. And then the laws that are in our hearts become the laws that our political bodies make. Where did the law that a woman ought to look, act, and be a certain way, ways that are not in the Bible or even in nature, where did they come from? From our imaginations, of course, and they are perpetuated by the works of imagination. And evangelicals have an imagination. We have a collective social imaginary. And that's what I'm going to unpack for a little bit now. The evangelical movement that I'm talking about is the one that began in the first decades of the 18th century. It's been around for 300 years. It has many different iterations, but it is a movement that began then and grew probably to its peak, actually, although we might say that peak continues or we might not, but in the 19th century in what was called in England the Victorian age. In fact, when one reads or studies Victorian literature, as I do, one is often confronted with striking similarities between the values and ideas of the Victorian age of the 19th century and the values and ideas of evangelicalism in the 20th and 21st century. These similarities are so frequent and so close, in fact, that when I teach Victorian literature, which is fairly often, I find myself or even my students often observing that something we thought was characteristic of evangelicalism or even actually Christianity is really just Victorian. So here's an example. I have a chapter in this book that I'm presenting in brief form here on I have a number of chapters. All the chapters center on the sort of metaphors and ideas that I find central to evangelicalism, and then see how they are fleshed out in works of literature and arts. So one chapter focuses on sort of the ideal or image of domesticity. And by the way, my dog is drinking loudly out of her water bucket. So if you hear that, that's what's going on. It's a hot day and she drinks with her whole head. But this chapter on domesticity focuses on what I think of an idea that has really shaped evangelicalism from before the 19th century through it and till now. It's an idea that has, kind of risen and fallen in the popular imagination. It comes in and out of style. It was really emphasized in the Victorian age, again in the 1950s, and certainly in some evangelical circles today. The work of literature that I think really shows the power of this image, which is not just about domesticity, but also emphasizes separate spheres for men and women and intensified norms for masculinity and femininity, is a work called The Angel in the House, which is a book-length poem authored by Coventry Patmore. He wrote it between the years of 1854 and 1862. He was a British poet. The poem came over to America, was published here, and was extremely popular, then became popular back in England. It's a narrative poem based on Patmore's real life wife and marriage. So it's not really exaggerated, but is just simply reflective of this domestic ideal. And as the title suggests, I probably don't have to explain it, the idea of the wife and mother being the angel in the house. Now, the poem is very long. As I said, it's book length, but I'm going to just read a few passages from it so that you can see how you can encounter this poem. And I think in encountering it, you will recognize an image of woman, of wife, and of domesticity that is very familiar to many of us. So here are a couple of lines I think that capture the whole essence of the poem. This is, again, the narrator is the husband, and he's talking about his wife. He says, "She is so lovely, true, and pure. Her virtue so endears that often when I think of her, life's meanness fills mine eyes with tears." This is the effect that the angel in the house has on the husband. We'll talk a little bit more about these tears in a short section I'll do near the end on sentimentality. Later in the poem, we see that the angel in the house, the wife, hangs on every word of her husband. And when he is harsh with her, she blames herself. Here are a few more lines that show this. "How often flings for naught and yokes her heart to an icicle or whim, whose each impatient word provokes another, not from her, but him. While she, too gentle even to force his penitence by kind replies, waits by, expecting his remorse, with pardon in her pitying eyes. And if he once by shame oppressed a comfortable word confers, she leans and weeps against his breast, and seems to think the sin was hers." This was the ideal that was being promoted at this time, and continues to be promoted, that the wife takes the blame for her husband's harshness. And another paradox in the poem, while the domestic woman was expected to be protected by a man, it was also, again, paradoxically, she who in her angelic nature had the power to draw her husband closer to God. Here's the poem. "I loved her in the name of God, and for the ray she was of him. I ought to admire much more, not less. Her beauty with a godly grace, the mystery of loveliness which made an altar of her face, was not of the flesh, though that was fair, but a most pure and living light, without a name, by which the rare and virtuous spirit flamed to sight." Now, I won't take the time here to do this, but I invite you to do this. I invite you to compare this portrayal in this poem. You can Google it and read a little if you want, but to compare the angel in the house with, and her virtue with that description of a virtuous woman found in Proverbs 31. Now, I'm not talking about the Proverbs 31 as misremembered or mythologized in popular culture and popular blogs. I'm talking about the actual text of Proverbs 31 as it actually describes a woman of virtue. I invite you to reflect on which image of woman has held more sway on the modern evangelical church. Is it the angel in the house or the Proverbs 31 woman as it actually describes her? And you don't need to have ever read The Angel in the House or even have heard of it to have been influenced by it, or to live in a culture that has been influenced by it, whether you knew that or not. And that's actually the kind of point that I'm trying to draw out. This is how a social imaginary works. While the work of imagination contributes to the making of a culture in turn provides individuals with a precognitive framework, a framework which includes unconscious, unarticulated, and unstated underlying assumptions. That's a lot of uns there, okay? I think you get the picture. A lot of unrecognized assumptions which direct, shape, and form our thoughts and desires and our imaginations in ways we don't necessarily recognize. Now, all of this idea comes from the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who calls these frameworks social imaginaries. Now, again, I know I'm getting very philosophical here. I actually taught a PhD seminar on this topic earlier this spring, and so it is quite philosophical. But bear with me, because I think this is important and interesting to anyone who loves literature. And if you signed up for this session, then you hopefully do, or you want to. And I really want to bring these, ideas down to a level that I think we all need to understand the sort of evangelical culture that we are part of. In his earlier work, one of his early works, Modern Social Imaginaries, Charles Taylor defines the social imaginary as a culture's shared pool of images, stories, and legends that shape one's social existence and expectations. What he calls, quote, the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. We all have expectations, whether they're conscious or not, and underneath those are actually notions, images, and norms that form them. Taylor says that the social imaginary forms, quote, a common understanding that enables us to carry out the collective practices that make up our social life, end quote. This understanding, he says, is both factual, it exists, and it's also normative. That is, he says, we have a sense of how things usually go, but this is interwoven with an idea of how they ought to go. So just to bring this down to everyday level, if you've ever gone to a very different culture in a different part of the world, you have probably encountered the way people just kind of go about some particular activity according to certain norms and expectations that you don't have. And no one explained it to you, and it's not written in a rule book somewhere or posted on the wall, but there are just people doing habits, engaging in practices that reveal norms and expectations that you don't have, and they're new to you. So those underlying norms and expectations would be part of the social imaginary. So in this way, a culture, any culture, is comprised of both the ingredients we know and recognize, like artifacts and social institutions, political institutions, ideas, beliefs, all the things that we talk about and write about and recognize. But along with those are the unexpressed assumptions and attitudes that make up the social imaginary. So we live in the modern age that emphasizes our individual autonomy and our own individual agency. And those are good things, but an emphasis on those things tends to make it harder for us to recognize the way what we think is our own or what we think is individual is actually shaped by the culture that we're in. And it can be difficult to, if not even impossible, to recognize this. So I'm going to cite a sort of a famous quote. You may have heard of it that explains all of this. It comes from a commencement speech made by the writer David Foster Wallace in 2005. It's a great little way to explain all this. And this is what he writes, or said in that speech, which is now published. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit. Then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the heck is water?" Or something like that. So that's what a social imaginary is. It's the water that we swim in. So much part of us that we actually don't even know it exists because it's so underlying everything. Yet, of course, human beings aren't goldfish. We don't live in water. But what we do live in is language. When the images we make from our imaginations emerge in our minds from a precognitive state, they accumulate meaning through language. So while it's helpful for us, and especially as Christians, I think so, to maintain and consider distinctions between image and word, there's also a way in which these things can't be separated, because images have meaning. I'm sorry, my dog, Eva, Big Eva, is looking for attention here. But there are ways in which the meaning that we associate with an image is inextricably bound to the language that we use to process and understand that image. So in some ways, image and word are inseparable. In their book, Metaphors We Live By, the scholars George Lakoff and Mark Johnson make an argument similar to Charles Taylor's when they describe, instead of using the word social imaginary, they use it's what they call a conceptual system. And this is what they say about that, and it echoes Taylor. The concepts that govern our thoughts are not just matters of the intellect. They also govern our everyday functioning down to the most mundane details. Our concepts structure what we perceive, how we get around in the world, and how we relate to people. Our conceptual system thus plays a central role in defining our everyday realities, end quote. So as with Taylor's social imaginary, Lakoff and Johnson have a conceptual system that is briefly just something that we are not aware of. So we are, in that respect, goldfish swimming in the water that we can't see. But what Lakoff and Johnson explain is that water consists of language. And a lot of their work is simply showing how some of the simplest, most everyday, ordinary, common uses of language that we have are actually metaphors that we have used them so much that we've forgotten that they're metaphors, and we think that they are literal. And so it's just an amazing book, and lots of examples of that. And so this talk about metaphors might make some of you have flashbacks to college literature classes, and that might be good or might be bad. But fear not, because metaphors, though they can be rich, complicated, and profound, are actually simple on one level, and they are part of our everyday thinking. A metaphor is simply a similitude. It is seeing one thing in terms of another, and this is just how we think and connect and process every day. And the Bible does too. James 4:14 says, "You are just a vapor that appears for a little while, then vanishes away." And Psalm 23 says, "The Lord is my shepherd." And we know instantly that these are metaphors. We aren't supposed to take them literally, and yet we understand what they're saying. And they're saying so much more than what they say literally, because that is how metaphors work. And in fact, that is how all language works. It is layered and resonant and metaphorical, some more than others, but we often just take that for granted and don't think of it. So what does all this have to do with the role of imagination and evangelicalism? Okay, I am getting there. First, I hope to have shown, even if briefly, just how central imagination is to all of us every day. Imagination encompasses far, far more than the creative works of art or ingenious inventions, and other sorts of things we tend to associate most commonly with imagination. Imagination is central to the way we think, the way we go through our days, and even the way we believe and enact those beliefs. Because there are particular imaginaries or conceptual systems in which we all exist, evangelicals, just like everyone else, are subject to a precognitive framework that shapes our imaginations, and even before doing that, prepares our perceptual ground. In other words, prepares what we pay attention to, readying it to register or not register, or process or not process those objects and phenomena from the world outside ourselves. Again, I'll return to James K. A. Smith when and quote him, he says, "It is because I imagine the world and my place in it in certain ways that I am oriented by fundamental loves and longings. My longings are not simply chosen by me. They are not self-generated decisions. We don't choose desires, they are birthed in us," end quote. In other words, what he's saying is that a social imaginary orients us before we make any decision on our own. Gaining our bearings, in other words, recognizing that water we're swimming in, requires us to first recognize that we have been oriented, much the way one who is is blindfolded and spun around. And then when the blindfold is torn off, we can see what direction we're facing, and we can decide which turns to take as we move forward. That's what we need to do at this moment in evangelicalism. We need to see where we are, what direction we are oriented in, so that we know which turns to take as we move forward. And the metaphors we live by orient us. To be an evangelical is to inherit a social imaginary that has been developing for as long as evangelicalism has existed as a coherent movement. And there are many definitions of evangelical out there. I draw heavily on the one by David Bebbington, the church historian. There are other important ones, but none of them even try to pretend that evangelicalism came into existence in 2016. It's really important that we understand that we have a 300-year history that has made us who we are and explains why we are the way we are. And whenever our imaginations are informed and formed by modernity or romanticism or Victorianism or any other ism, including evangelicalism, that is not in perfect unity with the essential orthodox historic biblical tenets of our faith, we risk being more cultural than Christian. So we must tease out the elements of the evangelical social imaginary in such a way that those elements that are truly biblical can be better distinguished from those that are merely cultural. And this is not to say that culture is bad. I mean, God designed it that we would be here in human culture rather than just simply skipping this part and uniting us with him in the new heaven and the new earth, which we know is coming, but we're in this in-between time. And it's important to understand that the ingredients of a social imaginary, even an evangelical one, are not necessarily consistent with each other. In fact, they may contradict not only each other, but they can contradict, as I've already pointed out, more clearly biblical ideas. But this is the nature of a social imaginary. It's a lot like watching a television, a commercial break during television. During those few minutes of break, we might see ads for fresh pizza, the latest model sports car, a financial investment firm, and bikini-clad women enjoying a Caribbean cruise. There's no logic that ties any of these tantalizing images together other than the fact that they're all designed to tantalize, but they even work against one another. I mean, the pizza doesn't help the bikini-clad body, and the sports car doesn't help your financial portfolio. As far as I don't know about those things, but I'm just guessing here. But all of these images seep into the viewer's imagination, leaving the mind consciously or unconsciously to work them out. Thus, our very desires are ordered, if not produced, by the power of our imagination and the social imaginary that is our context. So just in a couple minutes that I have left, and I know I'm probably already going too long, I wish that I could be there to hear your questions and thoughts and comments and so forth, but those will have to come some other way, I guess, some other time. But I've already mentioned that I have a chapter on domesticity, and that is one of the sort of central metaphors that I talk about in this book. But an even more essential metaphor or image is conversion, because evangelicalism arose specifically out of a need within Christianity in the 18th century, particularly in England, which had a state church, to bring back a godly biblical understanding of conversion, to help people recognize that you're not a Christian just because you were born into a Christian family or just because you go to the state church. Evangelicals understood and advanced the imperative that each person needs to have an individual conversion. So what we see besides the actual literal conversion is a whole, hundreds of years of literature that begin to emphasize the idea of conversion, and not just the religious conversion, but other echoes of conversion in stories and novels and other artifacts. So, for example, we begin with Pilgrim's Progress, which I think, because of its emphasis on conversion, helped bring about evangelical movement. We can then move from Pilgrim's Progress to a novel that really is modeled on it, Jane Eyre, where we see a conversion of Mr. Rochester. In Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, we see a conversion of Ebenezer Scrooge from a nasty, just greedy curmudgeon to someone who is generous and overflowing with love and for fellow man. It's one of the most dramatic conversions in all of literature. And we see lots of these sort of before and after stories in works of literature and art. And conversion is important, but one of the other aspects of having something like this in a social imaginary that is unexamined is that if we emphasize conversion at the expense of other biblical ideas, then we probably will err. So, for example, if we focus on conversion at the expense of discipleship or sanctification, that sort of warped imaginary will have an effect on individual believers and the church. So domesticity is one example in the evangelical social imaginary. Conversion, I talk also about the idea of improvement, which leads to self-improvement. Now, there are forms of it, such as the moral and social reform that William Wilberforce and his friends advocated for, that brought about the end of slavery and many other important social reforms. But sometimes those good efforts can turn into just improvement for its own sake, where we have a new cereal box that says new and improved just because we think that anything that's new and improved is automatically better. Improvement for improvement's sake is not a virtue, it's a vice. And then finally, I'll just point out one other example, because yes, I've gone on for long enough. It's one I referenced before that characterizes the poem The Angel in the House, and that is sentimentality or sentimentalism. And sentimentalism is an emphasis on emotion for emotion's sake. And this is something that has characterized the evangelical movement from the beginning, and not just evangelicals. I mean, evangelicals inherited it from what was called in the 18th century a cult of sensibility that arose at that time, that purported that you could measure your own virtue and character based on your ability to be sensible or empathetic to someone else's pain. And to be sensible or empathetic towards someone else's pain is a good thing. But if we assume that that feeling in itself and by itself with nothing else is virtuous, then we are going to err, just as we err when we become so sentimental that we come to desire cheap art or any cheap form of emotional response that skips over the hard work or the suffering or the sacrifice that is required for what is good. And in terms of literature, I'll just point to Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, which was literally satirizing this movement of sensibility that emphasized emotion for emotion's sake. Sentimentality, as I said, is just a shortcut to feeling, and shortcuts are not good. But any of these ideas that become embedded in an imaginary without being examined are by their very nature shortcuts. And that's why we need to look at them and know that they're there, just as the goldfish were searching for the water. So just to conclude quickly, what fills us forms us. This includes our imaginations. We imagine because we are made in the image of God. Our imaginations will be filled one way or another with some things or another. So the decision that we are faced with is simply to be conscientious and deliberate about what shapes our imagination, and what we do with the stories and images we use to fill it. Thank you so much.